Imagine for a second surviving a continent-wide revolution.
Just a massive, completely unprecedented upheaval.
Right. You've just spent, the last year of your life watching the entire world turn upside down. The barricades are literally smoking in the streets of Paris and Vienna and Berlin.
The springtime of the peoples.
Exactly, the springtime of the peoples. But as the smoke begins to clear, you realize the unthinkable has actually happened. Your side lost.
Completely lost.
Yeah. Your friends are imprisoned or, worse. And the old monarchs have just comfortably put the crowns right back on their heads.
Like nothing even happened.
Right. The democratic revolutions of 1848 have just failed entirely. So what do you do next? I mean, do you pick up a gun and blindly rush back out into the streets? Or do you, retreat, pick up a pen, and ruthlessly analyze exactly why those barricades fell?
Well, it is the ultimate test of intellectual discipline, really. When the world you fought for just collapses, the natural human instinct is, it's either total despair or just reckless emotional retaliation.
Just lashing out.
Right. Very few people possess the cold, almost, forensic detachment required to sift through the ashes of their own monumental defeat.
To find the actual structural reasons for that failure.
Exactly.
And that is exactly what we are exploring today. We are taking a deep dive into Volume 10 of the Marx and Engels collected works. Our mission here, for you listening, is to understand how two of the most famous and undoubtedly most polarizing thinkers in modern history processed a catastrophic political defeat.
And we're looking at a very specific window of time here.
Yeah, the autumn of 1849 through the summer of 1851. And I want to make something very clear to you right at the outset. Our goal here is not to endorse the political viewpoints or the ideology of these authors.
No, not at all.
We're exploring historical and philosophical texts entirely impartially. We're just unpacking the intellectual mechanics of how Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels responded to failure. We're going to be looking at their journal articles, their private letters, their military analyses, and even the internal meeting minutes of their organizations.
It's really about seeing how they built a completely new way of understanding history.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to understand these texts, you really have to understand the physical reality they were living in.
You do. By late 1849, the counter-revolution wasn't just, a political shift. It was a physical purge.
A violent one.
Very violent. In Germany, in Hungary, in Italy, the workers' organizations and the democratic societies that had sprung up in 1848, they were being violently dismantled.
Just crushed.
Yeah. Revolutionary leaders were being hunted down, they were driven into exile, or they were just executed outright.
And the scale of this defeat, it's hard to overstate. If you're looking at the letters Marx was receiving from Paris at the time, the situation in France was particularly grim.
Oh, absolutely.
Because France was, it was always the political earthquake center of 19th century Europe, right?
Always.
And the counter-revolution there was already aggressively clearing the way for Louis Bonaparte. He was laying the groundwork for what would eventually become his coup d'etat on December 2nd, 1851.
Which effectively destroyed the republic that the 1848 revolution had built in the first place.
Right. So it was this systematic hollowing out of democratic institutions. And watching this from the outside, Marx and Engels came to a pretty critical realization.
They did. During the uprising, they had observed that the revolutionary energy of society had, largely concentrated in the working class, the proletariat.
But energy alone isn't enough.
No, it's wildly insufficient. Witnessing the collapse of those 1848 and 1849 movements, it forced them to recognize that they needed to understand the specific objective features of those revolutions.
They needed to draw practical scientific lessons from the defeat, not just moral or emotional ones.
Exactly. So if you are Marx and Engels, your day-to-day life undergoes a massive pivot. Just months prior, they were active on-the-ground agitators.
Right, writing fiery daily newspaper columns urging people to take to the streets.
And now they are stateless refugees. And they shift into this period of intense, rigorous, theoretical summing up.
They're trying to generalize the experience of these massive continent-wide battles.
What's fascinating here is how this specific era of their work is characterized. They aren't writing an obituary for the revolution.
No.
They are attempting a complete systemic generalization of the experience, illuminated by this brand new philosophical conception. They are trying to determine the objective laws of class struggle.
But doing it in a highly suppressed environment.
Right. They are no longer riding the wave of an active revolution. They are sitting on the beach trying to figure out the gravitational pull that caused the tide to recede.
I want to try and ground this shift because it's a massive psychological change. It's like a sports team that just suffered a devastating, heartbreaking loss in the championship game.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. The season is over. The stadium is empty. The confetti on the floor belongs to the other team. Now, the instinctive reaction might be to immediately rush back onto the practice field in a blind rage,
Screaming, tackling each other.
just to burn off the frustration. But the most disciplined coaches don't do that. They lock themselves in a dark room. They pull out the projector, and they watch the game tape frame by frame in agonizing detail.
Agonizing is the right word.
But, and here's the key difference, Marx and Engels aren't just watching the tape to see who missed a tackle. They're watching the tape to figure out if the rules of the game itself are fundamentally rigged against them.
And if so, what the underlying mechanics of that rigging actually are.
Exactly.
That is a very apt way to frame it, because to analyze that game tape, to truly understand why the 1848 revolutions failed, they couldn't use the conventional analytical tools of the time.
Right. The conventional tools would just tell you which general was smarter or which politician gave a better speech.
Which doesn't actually explain the structural failure. They needed a new method. And that brings us to the specific tool Marx utilized and refined during this period, which is historical materialism.
So if the history of the 1848 revolutions is the game tape, historical materialism is the incredibly complex playback machine he invented to watch it.
That's a great way to put it.
And we see this most clearly in his major work from this volume, right? A series of articles that were later compiled into a book called The Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850.
Yes. And this text is a watershed moment in political philosophy. I mean, it represents the very first time Marx applies the method of historical materialism not to ancient history, but to a whole period of contemporary history.
He is taking events that happened mere months ago, events he was intimately involved in, and applying this cold, rigorous structural lens to them.
Which is an incredibly difficult psychological feat, if you think about it.
I mean, imagine trying to write an objective systemic history about a massive emotional event you just lived through. Your political faction just suffered a crushing defeat, your friends are in jail, you've lost your home.
The air is just thick with immediate political drama.
Fiery speeches, personal vendettas, betrayals. How difficult is it to pierce through that deafening noise to find a cold, underlying structural cause?
It requires shutting out almost everything that the people actually involved in the event think is important.
Wow.
Because the traditional view of history, the one written by the kings, the generals, the presidents, it always claims that their personal decisions, their grand ideas, or their willpower are what drive history forward.
And Marx just dismisses that entirely.
Entirely. He sets out to demonstrate the intercausal connection of these recent events. He argues that to understand the political theater, the fall of cabinets, the riots, the changing of laws, you have to look at the economic scaffolding holding the stage up.
He traces the political happenings back to their ultimate underlying economic causes.
Exactly.
Okay, let's slow down and really drill into this because this is the core of his entire worldview. You just mentioned tracing political events back to economic causes. What does that actually look like in the context of France in 1848?
Right.
Like, what economic signal did he find when he filtered out all that political noise?
Well, when Marx applied this materialist lens to the French Revolution of 1848, he noticed a very specific, fatal dynamic. He argued that what was actually defeated in the bloody days of June 1848 wasn't just the working class.
What was defeated were what he called the pre-revolutionary traditional appendages.
Okay, pre-revolutionary traditional appendages. That is an incredibly dense piece of 19th century terminology.
It is a bit of a mouthful.
We cannot let that just sit there. If I'm listening to this on my commute, I need to know exactly what those appendages are. Let's break that down into human terms. Who or what is he talking about?
Fair enough. Let's make it concrete. In February 1848, when the revolution first kicked off and overthrew the French monarchy, it wasn't just one group on the barricades. It was this massive, fragile alliance.
Okay.
You had the working class, the proletariat, but you also had the petty bourgeoisie.
Meaning like the small shopkeepers, the artisans, the local tavern owners.
Exactly. And you even had sections of the liberal bourgeoisie, the wealthier factory owners and merchants, who simply wanted a republic instead of a king.
So you have guys who own the factories standing right next to the guys who sweep the floors in those factories, and they're both cheering because the king is gone.
Yes. And in those early euphoric days of February, there was this massive illusion of universal brotherhood. They all thought they had the exact same interests simply because they all opposed the monarchy.
What they didn't?
No, they hadn't yet realized that their underlying economic foundations were completely incompatible. Those appendages, the petty bourgeoisie and the liberal bourgeoisie, they were attached to the working class movement not out of a shared long-term economic goal, but just out of temporary political convenience.
I see. So the appendages are these social relationships and political factions that haven't yet evolved into sharp, clear-cut class antagonisms. The lines are blurred.
Precisely. And Marx's historical materialism argues that you can only ignore economics for so long. As the revolution progressed from February to June, the economic reality set in.
The honeymoon phase ends.
Exactly. The workers wanted social guarantees, a right to work, better wages, systemic changes to how wealth was distributed. But the small shopkeepers and the liberal factory owners, they just wanted the economy to stabilize so they could go back to making a profit.
Right, because giving the workers what they wanted would threaten the property and the profits of those other groups.
So the economic base cracks.
And therefore, the political alliance above it completely shatters.
Shards everywhere. And the shattering was incredibly violent. In June 1848, the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie turned entirely against the working class, siding with the military to crush the workers' uprising.
Wow.
And Marx argues that this tragic defeat was, structurally speaking, a necessary clarifying moment. The illusions of universal brotherhood had to be burned away by the harsh reality of class interest.
The revolution couldn't move forward as long as it was weighed down by those pre-revolutionary appendages.
Exactly.
That is a deeply unsentimental way to view a massacre. I mean, he is essentially saying, yes, thousands of workers died, and that is a tragedy. But structurally, the movement is now free of the dead weight of the middle-class allies who were always going to betray them the moment their profit margins were threatened.
It is entirely unsentimental. It is an attempt at a pure scientific diagnosis of societal mechanics. He is arguing that political alliances are temporary, but economic interests are permanent.
So if the economic base of the revolution was fractured and contradictory, how did the newly established republic try to hold this fragile society together? Because usually, when a society fractures, the people in power try to write new laws to paper over the tracks, right?
They try to legally mandate stability.
Exactly.
Right.
Which perfectly transitions us to the next massive area of analysis in Volume 10, Marx's critique of the law itself.
Yes. So having examined the underlying economic base, Marx turns his attention to the political and legal superstructure that was built on top of it. He specifically targets the supreme legal achievement of the revolution, which was the French Constitution of 1848.
Right.
He wrote a brilliant, scathing article titled The Constitution of the French Republic, which was published in a Chartist journal in England called Notes to the People.
Wait, let me pause you again. You keep using these architectural terms base and superstructure.
Yeah.
Before we talk about the Constitution, let's make sure we define this model, because this is arguably the most famous concept Marx ever developed, and it's essential for understanding his critique of the law.
You're right. It is the foundational concept. Think of any given society as a two-story building.
Yeah.
The foundation, the ground floor, what Marx calls the base, is the economy. It is the raw material reality of how things are produced and who owns the tools to produce them.
It's the factories, the farms, the supply chains, and the relationships between the people who own them and the people who work in them.
Right. Now, everything built on top of that foundation is the superstructure. This includes the legal system, the political institutions, the media, the education system, religion, and even art and culture.
So the superstructure is basically society itself.
Yes, but Marx's core argument in historical materialism is that the base dictates the shape of the superstructure. A society whose economic base relies on slave labor will inevitably develop a legal system, a religion, and a culture that justifies and protects slavery.
Because the superstructure exists to maintain the base.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So if the economic base of France in 1848 was ultimately dominated by the bourgeoisie, the property-owning class, then the Constitution they write, the superstructure, is inevitably going to be designed to protect their property, regardless of how democratic it sounds on the surface.
Exactly. And that is exactly what Marx exposes in his article. He sets out to reveal the limited nature and class essence of bourgeois democracy. He takes this grand, sweeping document, which was universally celebrated as a massive victory for human rights and universal suffrage, and he ruthlessly dissects its actual mechanics.
He's basically saying, Don't listen to the soaring rhetoric of the preamble. Let's look at the actual gears and levers of the law.
Yes, he points out the flagrant, almost comical contradiction between the grand proclamations of democratic rights and liberties and the deeply anti-democratic reality of how those laws were structured.
And what was the primary mechanism they used to achieve this contradiction?
It was something Marx identified as constitutional reservations.
Constitutional reservations, essentially legal loopholes.
Precisely. The Constitution would loudly and proudly proclaim a fundamental human right in one sentence, but then attach a subtle reservation, a condition, or a referral to future organic laws that effectively reduced that proclaimed liberty to absolutely nothing.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this isn't just some dusty 19th century legal trivia.
Not at all.
The architecture of these documents, the way they use language to grant a right and take it away simultaneously, is something you and I interact with constantly today.
It is a very modern phenomenon.
It's exactly like modern terms of service agreements.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about the last time you downloaded a new app or signed up for a social media platform. You get that splash screen with the bold, flashing headline, "We believe in your absolute right to privacy. Your data is yours."
And you just click accept.
Right. And as a user, you think, great, this company respects me, I'm protected. But then, to actually use the app, you have to scroll down past 50 pages of dense, unreadable legal jargon.
That no one ever reads.
Exactly. And buried in there, in Section 9, Clause B, Subsection 4, the fine print, is a sentence that quietly adds, except when the company determines it is necessary to share your data with our third-party marketing partners for promotional optimization.
It is the exact same legal maneuver.
The bold print at the top gives you the right, but the fine print at the bottom takes it entirely away. You only have a right to privacy until it conflicts with their right to make a profit. Marx is essentially sitting at his desk in London reading the fine print of the 1848 Constitution.
That is a phenomenal analogy, because Marx provides specific, glaring examples of this from the French Constitution. For instance, the Constitution explicitly guaranteed the freedom of the press, the freedom of association, and the freedom of speech. Beautiful, democratic ideals.
Sounds great.
But each of these clauses contained a constitutional reservation stating that these freedoms could be exercised as long as they did not infringe upon public order or the rights of others.
Which begs the obvious question. Who gets to decide what constitutes a threat to public order?
Exactly. March points out that the power to define public order rested entirely with the existing state apparatus, the police, the military, the judges.
All of whom were controlled by the ruling economic class.
Right. Therefore, freedom of speech only existed as long as the speech didn't threaten the economic status quo. The moment workers used their freedom of assembly to strike for better wages, the state would declare a violation of public order and send in the military.
So the right was an illusion. The reservation was the reality. It is a masterclass in not taking institutional promises at face value. And again, as a reminder to you listening, we are impartially examining the intellectual framework Marx is building here. He is demonstrating how legal frameworks can be intricately designed to protect the existing power structures while simultaneously offering the illusion of total freedom to the masses.
It's a devastating critique of the architecture of legal language.
And it carries massive philosophical weight, because he is proving through real-time historical analysis that a constitution written by a specific economic class will ultimately, in its fine print, serve the material interests of that class, regardless of the universal democratic language it uses to dress itself up.
The legal document is not a neutral, objective arbiter of justice. It is a weapon forged by the economic base.
But, as the revolutionaries of 1848 learned the hard way, exposing the hypocrisy of a legal document doesn't actually stop a bullet.
No, it doesn't.
If constitutions and laws couldn't secure the revolution, and if the fine print was always going to be weaponized against them by the state, the ultimate decider of political power wasn't a clever lawyer in a courtroom pointing out a loophole.
It was a soldier on a battlefield.
It was raw, physical military force, which leads us logically to the next massive shift in their work. If the legal superstructure failed, they needed to understand the military reality.
Yeah.
And this is where Friedrich Engels really steps into the spotlight with a deep dive into the actual art of war.
This is one of the most remarkable and, frankly, surprising pivots in Volume 10. We move from Marx's critique of legal loopholes to an extensive, highly technical manuscript written by Engels titled Conditions and Prospects of a War of the Holy Alliance Against France in 1852.
That's quite a title.
It is. But this text is widely recognized as opening an entirely new stage in Engels' intellectual life. the elaboration of a Marxist military theory.
I have to admit, when I first read through the sources for this deep dive, I genuinely did a double take.
Oh, I'm sure.
Wait, Engels, the philosopher, the guy who wrote The Condition of the Working Class in England, the guy dissecting political economy, is suddenly nerding out over troop maneuverability, artillery placements, and the logistical supply chains of the Prussian army.
It seems bizarre at first glance.
It seems like such an incredibly massive leap from philosophy to military logistics.
It seems like a leap until you view it through the exact lens of historical materialism that we just established. If you accept that the economy is the base and everything else is the superstructure, then the military is not separate from that reality.
Okay, I see where this is going.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Engels realizes that military strategy isn't just about brave soldiers and brilliant generals. Military power is a direct expression of economic power.
Right. He is stripping away the romance of war, the cavalry charges and the glorious banners, and examining the raw material basis of military science.
Exactly. Engels argues that the art of war, the composition of an army, its tactics, its weaponry, its speed, all of this depends entirely on the economy and the social system of the country that fields it.
You cannot divorce a nation's military establishment from its industrial base.
You can't.
Let's break down the HOW of this because it's fascinating.
Yeah.
How exactly does economics change a battlefield in the mid-19th century? Like, what was Engels actually looking at?
He was looking at the Industrial Revolution. Prior to this era, moving an army of 100,000 men meant walking them across a continent.
Literally just marching them on foot.
Yes. It took months. They had to forage for food, they suffered massive casualties from disease just while marching, and their supply lines were fundamentally limited by the speed of a horse-drawn cart.
So war was slow.
Extremely slow.
And then a steam engine arrives.
Exactly. Engels realized that the introduction of the railway didn't just mean cheaper textiles or faster mail delivery, it fundamentally altered the geometry of warfare.
How so?
Well, if you have a highly developed railway network, which requires a massive industrial base capable of producing vast quantities of steel and coal, you can load 100,000 men onto trains in Berlin and have them on the French border in a fraction of the time.
Fully supplied and physically rested.
Precisely. Whoever controls the industrial steel output to build those tracks controls the speed of mobilization.
So war was no longer just about the tactical genius of a general on a hill with a telescope. It was about the efficiency of the factory floors back home.
It was about demographics, railway miles, and industrial capacity.
That's incredible.
And the sources detail how Engels does this deep, almost actuarial assessment of the military potentials of the various European states. Russia, Austria, Prussia, France.
He's actually running the numbers.
He's calculating their population demographics, their industrial output, their infrastructure, and using that hard data to predict how they would fare in a major conflict. He is essentially creating a materialist algorithm for predicting the outcome of wars.
But the texts also show that he doesn't just analyze the armies of the present, right? He takes this materialist logic and extrapolates it into the future.
He does.
Engels prophetically writes about what the army of a future, hypothetically successful socialist state would look like. And his predictions are fascinating. He argues that such an army would be unusually strong in combat, highly maneuverable, and possess an incredibly high degree of striking power.
And it is crucial to understand why he predicts this. It isn't just because he thinks socialist soldiers would have higher morale or more passion or, ideological purity.
His reasoning remains strictly materialist.
Yes.
Right, he isn't relying on the power of belief to win a war.
No, he argues this future army would be superior because a socialist society, by removing the contradictions and inefficiencies of capitalism, would theoretically unleash rapidly developing productive forces.
Meaning they'd be able to build better stuff faster.
Exactly. They would have more advanced technology, better logistics, a more educated population, and a flourishing culture. He is linking the emancipation of society directly to the unleashing of technological and industrial potential, which would inevitably reflect in its defensive military capabilities.
An advanced society produces an advanced military.
Exactly.
It's also worth briefly noting that Engels wasn't just looking forward during this period. He was also looking backward to prove his thesis. During this exact same window of exile, he writes The Peasant War in Germany, which takes these same concepts of class struggle and military logistics and applies them to the massive peasant uprisings of the 16th century.
He is tracing a historical lineage, proving that these material laws of war aren't just a 19th century phenomenon. They have deep historical roots. The weapons change, but the economic driver remains the same.
So if you step back and look at what they are accomplishing in Volume 10, it is staggering.
Mm.
You have Marx dissecting the legal and economic failures of the immediate past, proving why the revolution failed.
And you have Engels theorizing the material, industrial, and military requirements for any potential future success.
They are building a comprehensive scientific system out of the rubble of defeat.
They are.
But, and this is a massive but, while Marx and Engels were busy in their studies theorizing the maneuverability of hypothetical future armies and dissecting legal frameworks, back in the real world, the actual living revolutionaries who would have fled to London with them were dealing with a massive psychological crisis.
Oh, the tensions were boiling over.
They were broke, they were defeated, and the exiled community was tearing itself apart over the most pressing question of all. What do we do right now? And this brings us to a dramatic, bitter, and incredibly revealing internal split within their own ranks.
The psychological pressure of being a political exile is immense. I mean, you have been violently severed from your home, your purpose, and your community. And the sources detail the sharp, vitriolic ideological clashes that erupted inside the Communist League.
Which was the international organization that Marx and Engels had helped found and lead.
Right. And the pressure cooker finally explodes.
It does. The League fractures into two distinct, openly hostile sides. On one side, you have Marx, Engels, and their followers. They are arguing for exactly what we've been discussing, a period of intense study, structural analysis, and patience.
Because they recognize that the economic conditions for revolution have passed.
And I imagine taking a purely academic stance like that in a room full of furious, displaced, traumatized revolutionaries didn't go over very well.
It went over terribly.
If your friends just died on the barricades, the absolute last thing you want to hear from a guy sitting behind a desk is, the structural economic conditions aren't right, we need to go to the library. Who was pushing back against Marx in that room?
The opposition coalesced into what the texts describe as the sectarian faction, led by two prominent revolutionaries, August Willich and Karl Schapper.
And the Willich-Schapper faction, they had absolutely zero interest in studying economics or waiting for industrial capacities to develop. The sources make it clear that they demanded immediate, what Marx called premature actions.
They wanted to attempt to seize power right away.
They wanted to launch new armed uprisings. They essentially believed they could force a revolution back into existence through sheer willpower, bravery, and armed agitation. They believed passion could override economics.
Marx and Engels fought this idea tooth and nail. The texts provide us with a vivid, specific window into this clash. There is a transcript from the September 15th, 1850 sitting of the Central Authority of the Communist League.
Oh, I love that we have the actual minutes from this meeting.
Yes, the minutes of this meeting show Marx speaking directly and aggressively to this issue. He insists on the great harm that these premature, emotionally driven actions would cause. He explicitly identifies the current historical moment not as a pause, but as a revolutionary low tide.
A revolutionary low tide. That is such an incredibly evocative phrase. It perfectly captures the essence of their fundamental disagreement about how history moves. It makes me think of impatient surfers. Yeah. Let's say you have a surfer sitting out there on their board in the ocean. But the water is completely glassily flat. There is no swell, there is no storm system off the coast, there is simply no energy in the water.
Right.
But this surfer is so desperate to ride a wave, their identity is so tied up in being a surfer, that they start paddling furiously anyway. They exhaust themselves, thrashing in the flat water, trying to catch a wave that simply does not exist.
They are trying to substitute their own physical effort for the actual motion of the ocean?
Exactly. They think if they just paddle hard enough, the water will obey them.
No.
And meanwhile, Marx is sitting on the beach looking at a tidal chart, studying the lunar cycles and the meteorological reports, and he's yelling out to them, "Save your energy! Stop paddling! The material conditions for a wave do not exist right now.
The tide is out.
The tide is out, the wind is wrong, and if you keep thrashing around, you are just going to drown from exhaustion."
That analogy perfectly illustrates the core of Marx's argument against the Willich-Schapper faction. Marx is asserting that a revolution, just like a wave, is not a pure act of human will.
You can't just wish it into existence.
No, it cannot be conjured out of thin air simply because the revolutionaries deeply desire it, or because their cause is just, or because they are willing to die for it. The underlying economic and social conditions, the material base, must be ripe. the ocean must be moving.
Right.
If the economic contradictions of capitalism aren't acute enough to push the masses into action, a vanguard of radical exiles trying to start a shootout will just end up dead or in prison.
But think about the sheer force of character it takes to hold that line. It takes an incredible amount of intellectual maturity and, frankly, an incredibly thick skin. Picture that room on September 15th, 1850. You are standing in front of passionate, angry people who have lost everything.
People who are hurting.
Deeply hurting. And you have to tell them to stand down. You have to tell them that their bravery is currently useless and they might have to wait years, maybe decades, for the economic conditions to shift. The backlash must have been horrific. You are going to be called a coward, a traitor, an armchair philosopher who abandoned the cause.
And the historical record shows they were called all of those things, and worse. The split was incredibly bitter.
I can imagine.
But this raises an important question, one that I think applies far beyond the radical politics of the 19th century. I want the listener to consider the balance between idealism and material reality in any major movement, organization, or even personal endeavor.
Like, how do you maintain your ultimate goal, your visionary ideal, without losing sight of the cold, hard, often unyielding reality of the present moment?
Exactly. The Willett-Schapper faction let their intense idealism and their emotional trauma detach them from reality. Marx and Engels, despite the personal attacks, were trying to anchor their idealism to a rigorous, scientific understanding of what was actually physically and economically possible.
It is the ultimate conflict between emotion and strategy. But we have to remember that surviving this revolutionary low tide wasn't just about winning high-minded theoretical debates in smoky committee rooms in London.
They weren't exactly living a comfortable academic life.
Not at all. The reality of their exile was a gritty, daily, desperate struggle for survival. They were political refugees in one of the most brutal capitalist cities on Earth. And they had to rely on whatever meager journalism they could scrounge up just to keep their heads above water.
Yes, we cannot let the grand, sweeping theories we've been discussing obscure the squalid reality of their lives. Volume 10 is absolutely full of the day-to-day evidence of this struggle. These texts weren't produced in a comfortable, ivy-covered ivory tower.
No.
The volume contains numerous private letters, public statements to the press, and short, punchy articles that deal entirely with their immediate, dangerous reality.
If you read the titles of these smaller pieces, it paints a vivid picture of the paranoia and the constant harassment they faced. We're looking at pieces titled Prussian Spies in London, the German Social Democrats in the Times, and various public statements urgently defending other German refugees from deportation.
They weren't just observing history from a balcony. They were actively being hunted by the agents of the history they were trying to write about.
The absolutist and bourgeois governments of Europe certainly hadn't forgotten about them. They were terrified of the exiles.
Our sources show that Marx and Engels were constantly having to expend precious time and energy exposing the slander and persecution of revolutionary leaders by the conservative press.
They were fighting an exhausting, asymmetric media war against established newspapers.
Trying to clear the names of their comrades who were facing sham trials back on the continent and exposing the vast networks of Prussian secret police that were physically tracking them through the streets of England.
I want you to really paint a picture for yourself of what it meant to be in Marx's position in 1850. You are stateless. You are living in London, which at the time is a massive, smog-choked, incredibly unequal metropolis.
There are cholera outbreaks.
You are living in abject poverty in the slums of Soho. Your children are getting sick. You are constantly pawning your own winter coats just to buy paper to write on, or to pay the rent so your family isn't thrown out onto the street.
You are surveilled by foreign secret police going through your mail.
And in the midst of all of this misery, disease, and paranoia, you are trying to fundamentally re-engineer the human understanding of history and economics.
And they utilized every single avenue available to them to keep their intellectual project breathing. They founded short-lived journals that went bankrupt after a few issues. They wrote furious letters to newspaper editors who often refused to publish them. They wrote pamphlets.
They were grinding.
Engels, for instance, didn't only retreat into grand military theory. He was acutely engaged in the current social problems right outside his front door. He wrote deeply detailed articles like The 10 Hours Question, analyzing the immediate brutal labor struggles of the English working class in the factories of Manchester and London. They never stopped analyzing the material conditions around them.
So what does this all mean? How do we synthesize this? How do we connect the day-to-day misery of being a starving, surveilled refugee writing angry letters to the editor of the Times with the grand, world-historic philosophical concepts of historical materialism, the critique of bourgeois legal constitutions, and the materialist algorithm of warfare?
It means that we have to understand that their grand theories were fundamentally born out of gritty, street-level political survival. Their theoretical rigor wasn't an escape from the harsh reality of their defeat. It was a weapon forged directly in the face of it.
It was a survival mechanism.
The police persecution they faced, the slander they read in the press, the spies outside their windows, all of it practically validated their developing theory. It proved to them every single day that the state apparatus, the legal system, the media, and the police were all seamlessly aligned to protect the dominant economic interests.
So their miserable daily lives in London were just a living microcosm of the macro-historical forces they were analyzing on paper.
The base and the superstructure weren't abstract concepts. They were the forces keeping them poor and hunted.
Okay, let's pull all of this together because we have journeyed through a profoundly intense and incredibly dense period of history. Volume 10 of the collected works captures a vital, almost chrysalis-like stage for Marx and Engels.
It really does.
They're violently defeated on the barricades of Europe. Their movement is crushed. But instead of giving up or giving in to the emotional suicidal urges of the Willich-Schapper faction to just keep fighting a lost war, they retreat to the archives and the cramped studies of London.
And in that deliberate, disciplined retreat, they accomplished something monumental.
They birthed a completely new way of analyzing history through the lens of underlying economics historical materialism. They ruthlessly dismantled the fine print and the illusions of supposedly democratic legal constitutions.
Engels pioneered a brilliantly materialist approach to understanding how industrial capacity dictates military theory.
And together, they fought off the impatient urges of their own allies who wanted to frantically force a wave in a flat ocean.
It is ultimately a profound testament to the immense value of low tides.
Well, I love that phrase, low tides.
When you are forced into retreat, when the forward momentum of a movement or a life is shattered, it is a critical, irreplaceable opportunity for reflection. Knowledge is most valuable when it is understood in its proper context. Sometimes the periods where action seems impossible, where you feel completely trapped by circumstance and defeat, are exactly when the most critical, foundational, long-term thinking must occur. The intellectual architecture that Marx and Engels built during this miserable, poverty-stricken low tide in London would go on to fundamentally define global politics, revolutions, and wars for the next century and a half.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends. Think about the metaphors we've explored today. The sports team watching the agonizing game tape to find the structural flaws.
The fine print of the terms of service that takes away the rights the bold print promised.
The surfer furiously paddling for a wave that simply isn't there. When you face a massive setback or a crushing defeat in your own life, your career, or your organization, how do you react?
Do you react like the Willich-Schapper faction? Do you frantically and emotionally try to force immediate action just to regain a fleeting feeling of control, thrashing around in flat water, exhausting your resources?
Or do you take the approach we've explored in Volume 10? Do you possess the cold, unsentimental discipline to step back, lock yourself in the room, watch the game tape, and rigorously analyze the underlying systemic structural forces that caused your failure in the first place? Do you have the patience to wait for the tide to return and the intelligence to build a better boat while you wait?
It is the profound difference between simply reacting to the history happening around you and actually understanding the mechanics of how history is made.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Volume 10 of the collected works, The Architecture of Defeat and the Birth of Historical Materialism. Keep reading, keep asking the hard questions, and always, always read the fine print of the world around you.